Do you remember ever getting that feeling where the air just turns thick? Not humid, like a Wichita summer, but heavy, like the atmosphere is physically pressing down on your shoulders because it knows something you don't? That's how it started. My name's David Goodson, and look, I spent the last decade as a park ranger, so I'm not some city kid who gets spooked by a snapping twig or a hooting owl. I know what's supposed to be in the woods. More importantly, I know what isn't. Last spring, I took some personal time and drove up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, specifically toward Tahquemon Falls area. The locals there have stories, not the kind they put on postcards or sell fudge, but the kind they whisper at the end of the bar when the tourists leave. They talk about the rougarou or the wildman, but mostly they just talk about it. Being a ranger, I've always been fascinated by regional cryptid lore, usually as a way to debunk it. I figured a week of solo hiking through those dense, gray-skied pine forests would be the perfect way to clear my head. The weather was classic Michigan spring, perpetually cloudy, a ceiling of slate-colored mist hanging just above the tree line. I'd set up a base camp about 12 miles away from the nearest paved road. On the third day, I found the first structure. It wasn't a cabin or a lean-to, it was 3 young birch trees snapped at exactly 6 feet off the ground and woven together into a perfect inverted tripod. Fresh wood was exposed, but there were no tool marks, no saw teeth, no axe nicks, just raw, splintered force. As I knelt to examine the weave, the forest went dead silent. You know the Oz effect? It's when the birds stop, the insects go mute, and even the wind seems to hold its breath. That's when the smell hit me. It wasn't just rot, it was a combination of wet dog, stagnant swamp water, and the sharp metallic tang like old copper pennies. I stood up, reaching instinctively for the bear spray on my hip, and that's when I heard the whistle. It was long, low, and sounded disturbingly human, except no human lungs could hold a note that long or that deep. It came from the ridge to my left, and then a second later, an identical whistle answered from the cedar swamp to my right. I wasn't just being watched, I was being signaled. I backed away from the birch structure, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I told myself it was just a prank, or maybe a couple of eccentric locals messing with a hiker. But then I saw the footprint in the soft, thawed mud near the creek. It was nearly 17 inches long, 5 inches wide at the heel, and the mid-tarsal break, the way the foot flexed in the middle, was something no boot or prosthetic could mimic. The depth of the impression suggested whatever stepped there weighed at least 800 pounds, and the scariest part, the mud was still oozing into the print. It had just happened. I was less than 30 seconds behind it. I decided right then to cut the trip short and head back to camp, grab my gear and get out. But as I turned, I saw a movement in the periphery of the pines. A tall, dark shape that didn't move like a bear. It moved with a fluid bipedal gait, sliding behind a massive hemlock with a speed that felt wrong. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "I'm a ranger. I'm armed." Silence. Then a rock the size of a grapefruit soared out from behind the trees and slammed into a trunk 3 inches away from my head. It wasn't a warning shot, it was a range-finding toss. I didn't stick around to see if they had a second rock. I moved fast. Not a blind run because that's how you break an ankle in the UP brush, but a controlled, high-speed retreat. Every few yards I'd glance back, and every time the woods felt smaller, the trees closer together. The sky was deepening into bruised purple as the heavy clouds began to leak a cold, needle-like rain. By the time I reached my campsite, I was drenched in a cocktail of sweet and freezing precipitation. My tent, a sturdy orange North Face I'd used on a dozen missions back in Kansas, looked pathetic and flimsy against the backdrop of those ancient, shadow-choked woods. I didn't pack, I shoved. I was throwing my sleeping bag into its sack when I heard the first wood knock. Clack. It was the sound of heavy timber hitting a hollow trunk, echoing through the valley like a rifle shot. It came from the north. 5 seconds later, a response came from the south. They were closing the perimeter. I reached into my pack and pulled out my Glock 20, the 10mm I carry for predators, and laid it on a stump next to me. As a ranger, I'm trained to respect wildlife, but this didn't feel like wildlife. This felt like being haunted by something with a grudge. As the light failed completely, the harassment moved from visual to auditory. Around my camp, just beyond the reach of my headlamp's beam, I could hear the chuffing. It sounded like a massive set of bellows, deep, rhythmic huffs of air that carried the same copper and skunk stench. Then came the vocalizations. It wasn't a growl or a scream, it was a series of mutterings. It sounded like two people having a conversation in a language made of glottal stops and wet clicks, muffled by a thick wall. I sat on my gear, pistol in hand, my headlamp cutting a frantic arc through the dark. Suddenly, something heavy hit the ground on the edge of the clearing. I swung the light toward the sound and caught a pair of eyes. They weren't glowing like a deer's. There was no tapetum lucidum reflecting the light. These were dull, deep red, set wide apart in a massive sloping head. The creature was crouched, its long, hair-covered arms draped over its knees. Even hunched over, it looked 7 feet tall. Its hair was matted, dark brown and caked with dried mud and forest debris. It didn't look like a monster from a movie. It looked like a man who had been stretched, distorted, and forgotten by time. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only seconds. The muttering from the trees behind me got louder, more insistent. The creature in front of me stood up, unfolding itself like a piece of nightmare origami. It loomed over the camp, at least 8.5 feet of pure, corded muscle. It bared its teeth, square, yellowish, and terrifyingly human, and let out a sound that I still hear in my sleep. It was a subsonic vibration that I felt in my teeth before I heard it in my ears. A roar that ended in a high-pitched, soul-shredding shriek. It was a challenge. I fired a shot into the dirt at its feet, hoping the muzzle flash and the boom would scare it off. It didn't flinch. It just tilted its head, looked at the smoking hole in the ground, and then looked back at me with an expression of pure, cold intelligence. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with an animal. I was dealing with a rival. The gunshot didn't create a panic, it created a shift in the atmosphere. In my ears as a ranger, I've seen bears bolt at the sound of a dry branch snapping. But this thing, this Bigfoot, as the world calls it, merely narrowed those dull red eyes. The silence that followed the crack of the 10mm was more terrifying than the roar. To my left, another heavy weight shifted in the brush, the branches groaning under a massive burden. I realized then that the one in front of me was the distraction, the alpha drawing my fire while the others moved into flanking positions. I wasn't just in a standoff, I was in a kill zone. I grabbed my pack, swinging it onto one shoulder while keeping the Glock leveled at the massive shape. "Back off," I screamed, my voice sounding thin and pathetic against the backdrop of the Michigan wilderness. The creature took a step forward, its movements eerily silent for something of its bulk. It didn't lumber, it glided, its knees staying slightly bent in a way that keeps its head perfectly level. I fired again, this time aiming for the tree trunk right next to its shoulder. Bark sprayed, and the creature let out a huff of indignation, retreating 2 steps back into the shadows of the hemlocks. That was my window. I turned and bolted toward the narrow trail that led back toward the Tahqueman River. I knew the terrain was treacherous, exposed roots, slick, mossy limestone, but I also knew that staying in that clearing meant I wouldn't see the sunrise. Behind me, I heard the sound of pursuit. It wasn't the sound of an animal chasing prey, it was the sound of something herding. Heavy thuds echoed to my left and right, keeping pace with me, breaking branches with a casual, terrifying strength. They were funneling me toward the ravine. I reached the edge of the limestone drop-off, the river churning white and cold 50 feet below. I spun around, my headlamp flickering as the batteries began to fail under the strain of the cold. Out of the darkness, a massive hairy hand, long-fingered with dark, thick nails, swung out and caught the strap of my backpack. I was jerked backward with such force that my feet left the ground. I hit the mud hard, the wind leaving my lungs in a sharp gasp. The alpha was over me in an instant, its shadow blotting out the few stars peeking through the clouds. It didn't use a claw, it balled a fist the size of a Thanksgiving turkey and slammed it into the ground next to my ear, shattering a limestone rock into powder. I didn't think, I acted on pure, raw survival instinct. I rolled, drawing the canister of bear spray from my belt, and unleashed a cloud of orange fire directly into the creature's face. The capsaicin hit it at point-blank range. The effect was immediate. The creature let out a sound I can only describe as a wet, gurgling scream, clutching at its face with both hands. It stumbled back, thrashing blindly, its massive frame colliding with a cedar tree and snapping it like a toothpick. The muttering from the woods turned into frantic, high-pitched yips. This was my only chance. I scrambled to my feet, my chest burning, and looked at the black water of the river below. It was a 50-foot drop into a freezing current, or staying up here with a blinded, vengeful god. I took a breath, tucked my chin, and jumped. The impact with the water felt like hitting a brick wall. The Tahqueman River in spring is a churning slurry of melted ice and tannins, and the shock of it nearly shut my hair down on the spot. I went deep, the weight of my remaining gear pulling me toward the rocky bottom before I managed to kick free and surface, gasping for air that felt like liquid fire. Above me, On the limestone ledge, I saw the silhouette of the alpha. It was standing at the very edge, its massive chest heaving, the orange residue on the bear spray glowing faintly in my dying headlamp's peripheral beam. It didn't jump after me. It just watched, a silent, towering sentinel against the grey clouds. I let the current take me, bouncing off submerged logs and jagged rocks, bruising my ribs and tearing my fingernails as I clawed at the water. I must have floated for miles, drifting into a state of hypothermic shock where time stopped making sense. Eventually the river slowed into a wider, shallower bend, and I managed to drag myself onto a muddy bank. I crawled until my hands hit gravel, a Forrest service road. I didn't have the strength to stand, so I just lay there, shivering violently, watching the sun begin to bleed through the clouds in a pale, sickly yellow. A local logging truck found me 2 hours later. The driver, a guy named Miller, who'd lived in the UP his whole life, didn't ask a single question when he saw my state. He just wrapped me in a wool blanket, handed me a thermos of black coffee, and drove. It wasn't until we were 30 miles away that he spoke. "You saw the old man of the woods, didn't you?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the road. I didn't answer. I just stared at my hands, which were still stained with the mud of a place I never should have gone. He nodded slowly, as if my silence was the loudest confirmation he'd ever heard. "They don't like visitors this time of year," he added. "Spring is when they're hungry, and they're protective of the young." I eventually made it back to Wichita, but I'm not the same park ranger I was before that trip. I still work the flats of Kansas, where the horizon is wide and there are no places for 8-foot giants to hide. But every time the wind whistles through the grass, I jump. I never reported the encounter officially. Who would believe a ranger claiming he got into a fistfight with a myth? But sometimes, late at night, I check the bottom of my old hiking pack. There's a small, coarse clump of dark hair caught in the buckle. It doesn't match any known North American mammal, and when I hold it, I can still smell that metallic copper tang. People wonder why I don't hike the deep woods anymore. I tell them I've seen enough of the world to know that some borders aren't meant to be crossed, and some legends are just truths we aren't brave enough to face. Be careful if you head north this spring, and if you hear a whistle that sounds a little too human, don't whistle back.